Chapter 7. Don Bosco's Other Activities. With all the work of foundation and organization connected with the oratory at Bosco, and because the establishment was obliged to live from hand to mouth, it would seem that Don Bosco had enough to occupy his days and a greater part of his nights without undertaking anything else. Although it has been necessary to describe the events leading up to the foundation of his oratory on a solid basis, and to relate the immense development of the work in the course of a few years, thus giving the impression that it accounted for the whole of his activity, to imagine that it would do so would be far from the truth. One of the difficulties facing the biographer of this many-sided priest is to show him as he was at work. Constantly we find that some particular activity which he combined with all his other undertakings, some characteristic effort of his apostolate, has escaped us. We have seen how, from the beginning of his work for boys, he was willing to improvise, doing always everything in his power to achieve the end in view and leave the outcome to God. Sure in his purpose, and sure the means that which he employed were the best available to him at that moment. By bringing the account of the development of his work down to 1856, when it gave every appearance of being firmly established, we have been obliged to admit some of his activities and to pass over in silence some of the events of Italian history that were not without their influence on his life. The years 1846 to 50 were a period of crisis in Italian affairs. The proclamation of the Piedmontese Constitution in Turin on the 4th of March 1848 by Charles Albert and the Austrian War of the same year were merely partial results of the firmament which was endemic during those years and for some time afterwards. The realization of the unity of the country, which was in active preparation during the period preceding 1870, was something more than the work of politicians. It sprang from every class. It was a movement embracing all sorts of tendencies, patriotic, military, philosophical and religious. Summed up under the name of Risorgimento, it stands for a whole body of ideas at work in men's minds in those days. Don Bosco could not afford but be affected by it. It seems that every air he breathed was impregnated with it. Certainly, it exerted a considerable influence on the events of his life, yet he was no politician. During all those troubled years, he kept himself aloof from politics. In politica sono di nessuno. In politics, I belong to no one, was his watchword. His business, as he saw it, was the establishment of the kingdom of God in the hearts of the young, and whatever and whoever could help towards that end was used by him to the full. Liberals and conservatives alike were called on for assistance and gave it. Under the new Piedmontese Constitution, Protestants and Jews obtained certain freedoms that hitherto had been lacking to them. As a consequence, the years immediately following witnessed an epidemic of propaganda on behalf of the Waldensians, a Protestant sect which had been established in the Alps for some centuries, and now, with its newfound freedom, was spreading with great energy into the plains, and finally into Turin itself. Their appeal was chiefly to the unlettered and the ignorant, those who could read a little but were incapable of forming a sound judgment on what they had read, and whose faith rested on a slender enough basis for it to be easily shaken by pamphlets with popular appeal. Some answer was forthcoming from the Catholic side, but it was hardly calculated to influence those who had been in most need of it, for it was addressed to the educated, to the theologian, and thus was ineffectual to stem the growing success of the Waldensian campaign. Don Bosco saw the perils of the popular press and the harm that it was capable of doing. He saw the immense amount of good that was being achieved by the same means. He was always up to date, a man of his times, and very often in advance of them. He knew that it was worse than useless merely to denounce the anti-Catholic tracts put out by the Waldensians. To do so would be attract attention to them. The essential task was to put something in their place. He believed that the forces of evil could be combated with their own weapons. If they used modern methods in furthering their cause, he would do the same, only better. Thus he inaugurated his Catholic readings, booklets which quickly attained a circulation of 14,000 or more apiece. Breezily written, cheaply produced, easy to read, yet always with a kernel of dogmatic or moral teaching. A great number he wrote himself. Others he prevailed upon his friends to write. At the end of 1853, the Fireside Friend, a popular almanac which was distributed gratis and became immensely popular, was a new weapon of the Waldensians. Don Bosco's reply was not far behind. His own almanac, put together during the following summer holidays and called Il Guantomo, was ready for the beginning of 1854. It was distributed, in fact, during the months of 1853 in order to forestall any further issue of the Fireside Friend for the following year. Don Bosco's publication was an immediate success. It contained something for everyone: cookery recipes, religious instruction, astronomical information, a list of fairs, anecdotes, and all the 101 items of miscellaneous and out-of-the-way information that are to be found within the covers of a popular almanac. Il Guantuomo successfully ousted the Fireside Friend and has appeared continuously since those days. All this work was not done without opposition. Don Bosco was drawn into oral controversy. He was increasingly called upon to answer difficulties, to instruct, to settle arguments. His opponents did not take their defeat with good grace, and from polite endeavours to silence him proceeded to less reputable methods. One Sunday, while he was giving a catechism lesson to his boys in the shed rented from Pinardi, an attempt on his life was made by a hired assassin who fired at him from the window. The shot passed under Don Bosco's arm, making a hole in his cassock. On other occasions he was summoned to spurious sick calls. Ambushes were laid for him. From all he escaped safely, aided by his native wit, once or twice by the strength of his arm, trusting always in divine protection, which sometimes seemed to come visibly to his aid. In his memoirs, the last chapter is called A Mysterious Dog, Grigio. He tells us there the story of the protection that he received from time to time from a strange grey dog. Grigio means grey. All sorts of attempts had been made to account for the presence of this animal, which arrived always opportunely when Don Bosco needed protection and at other times was nowhere to be seen. Some have suggested that it was an angel which assumed the form of a dog. Others that it is a stray which became attached to Don Bosco. Whatever explanation is preferred, there is no doubt that its appearances were always providential, and that it acted as an instrument of protection on behalf of one of God's servants. Those who saw it have described it as like an Alsatian, others about 3 feet high, and of a ferocious mien. The first time that Margaret Bosco set eyes on it, she cried out in alarm. In those days, the Valdocco quarter was not built over as it is now, and to reach the oratory it was necessary to traverse a wide stretch of rough ground, dotted with trees and bushes. On account of the many attacks to which he had been subjected, Don Bosco was obliged to refrain from going out unaccompanied. One evening, however, he was returning alone from some expedition, and coming to the waste land, was making his way across it, as he tells us, not without fear, when suddenly a large dog bounded to his side, and for the moment terrified him still more. Yet its attitude was not threatening, Don Bosco goes on. It was rather like a dog that had just recognized its master. We soon made friends, and it went with me as far as the oratory. That was not the only time I encountered it. On different occasions it kept me company, sometimes providentially. Towards the end of November 1854, one sleety night, I was returning from the town. In order not to be alone, I took the road leading from the Consolata down to the Cotolengo Institute. At one point I noticed that 2 men were walking a short distance in front of me, matching their pace with mine. I crossed over to the other pavement to avoid them, but they did the same. I then tried to turn back, but it was too late, for they suddenly faced about and in 2 steps were on me. Without a word, they threw some kind of a coat over me. In vain I struggled to set myself free. One of them tried to gag me with a scarf. I wanted to shout out, but I had not the strength. At that moment, Grigio appeared, growling like a bear, and hurled himself at the first man with his paws at his throat, snarling meanwhile towards the other. They were obliged to let me go in order to deal with the dog. "Call off your dog," they shouted, almost paralyzed with fear. "I'm going to," I replied, "but leave passers-by alone." "Call him off quickly," they shouted. Grigio went on barking. The ruffians made off as fast as they could, and Grigio accompanied me to the Cotolengo, where I stopped to recover myself a little. Then I returned to the oratory, this time under safe escort. Every evening, when I ventured out into this deserted quarter alone, I noticed Grigio on one side of the road or the other. The boys at the oratory frequently touched him. On one occasion, the dog arrived at the oratory while Don Bosco was at table with some priests and his mother. He offered the animal food, but it would not touch it. I remember that evening I had returned rather late, and that a friend had given me a lift in his carriage. It seemed that Grigio wanted to make sure that nothing happened to me. It was a strange animal. One evening it flatly refused to allow Don Bosco to leave the house, lying across the threshold and growling whenever he tried to pass. "If you won't listen to me, listen to the dog. It has more sense than you have," remarked his mother. A quarter of an hour later, a neighbor came in to say that he had heard of a plot to waylay Don Bosco that night. When attempts to harm him ceased, the dog disappeared and was not seen again save once in 1883, when Don Bosco, accompanied by one of his priests, arrived late at night at the station at Bordighera, and finding no one to show him the way, he was wandering about through the dark and stormy night, trying to find the Salesian house. He was suddenly welcomed by a bark, and Grigio appeared and led him to the house. All sorts of stories have been told about this dog, remarks Don Bosco, but I never discovered who his master was. All I know is that amid the many dangers that threatened me, this animal furnished me providential protection. In fact, Don Bosco never tried to discover whose dog it was. What does it matter? He inquired. The principal thing is that it is my friend. And when at a friend's house in Marseilles, he was recounting the dog's sudden appearance in 1883 at Bordigliera, and it was pointed out to him that his Grigio must be 2 or 3 times the normal age for a dog. He merely said that it was no doubt true. Perhaps it's his son, or even his grandson, he concluded. What has been said of Don Bosco's literary activity by no means accounts for the whole of it. Altogether, he was responsible for 130 publications, pamphlets, textbooks, editions of the classics. He wrote a history of Italy, which was translated into English by an Anglican clergyman and published in London in 1881. He wrote plays for his boys, even one about the metric system, intended to drive home with humour the lessons of the booklet that he had previously composed. His religious writings nearly all appeared in his Catholic readings, where, he felt, they would reach the largest public. At first, his works were printed by firms in the town, and it was not until 1861 that he was able properly to start a printing press of his own. He began, of course, in a small way, with second-hand presses housed in a room on the first floor near his own. It was the forerunner of the magnificent Silesian printing shops to be found nowadays in many countries of the world. To accomplish all this, he was obliged to work long hours at night, with the rest of the house was asleep. Every moment was precious. He was always busy. He aimed not at literary effect, at a polished production, but at simplicity, and as a consequence, what he produced was not only well adapted to the audience for which it was intended, but achieved a nobility and directness of style that in this kind of writing is uncommon. With his 500 boys and 150 boarders and his writings, his days and nights were filled, it would seem, to capacity. Sometimes dawn would surprise him still at his work table, and all his adult life he never slept more than 5 hours a night, an allowance that was frequently reduced but never increased. Yet what has been related by no means exhausts the field of his activity. His zeal was insatiable. He seemed never to miss an opportunity of working for the good of souls, particularly of the young. In the following chapters, the story of his life and his life work is unfolded. From time to time, examples will occur indicating clearly that his activity was not confined to the establishment of his oratory and of the congregation which bears his name. Some few instances of what may be called this supplementary activity are given here as the conclusion of this chapter. At Christmas 1849, he decided to organize a retreat for the boys of Turin. He had a nucleus in those attending the 3 festive oratories in the town, but he wanted to reach as many as possible. He had notices printed and distributed to parents, employers, and all likely to forward his scheme, and saw that they were posted in places where they would catch the eye. He paid countless visits to persuade those whom he considered needed convincing of the desirability of such a retreat. As the boys would be working during the day, the timetable was arranged to suit their hours of work. At 5:30 a.m., Mass and instruction. At midday, Mass and pulpit dialogue. At 7 p.m., instruction and benediction. The retreat lasted a week and ended with general communion. Despite the early start and the prospect of a full day's work in front of them, the youths attended in their hundreds. The pulpit dialogue was especially popular. Don Bosco had been careful to obtain preachers who could interest their audience. The retreat was a great success and in subsequent years became an established institution. During the cholera epidemic of 1854, Don Bosco found full scope for his energy. The scourge fell upon the town at the end of July and claimed something like 60 cases a day, at least half of which were fatal. In 3 months there were 2,500 cases and 1,400 deaths. The disease was particularly severe in the poorer quarters of the town, and of these the Valdocco quarter was one of the worst. During those terrible 3 months, Don Bosco spent his days at the bedside of the sick and dying. Nor did he confine his ministrations to the spiritual works of mercy. He did what he could for the body as well. One of the problems of the epidemic was the fear that it inspired among those who were not stricken by it. Directly a case was diagnosed, the patient was abandoned by those about him, and though the municipality had set up 2 isolation hospitals for the 2 worst areas in the town, there was frequently no one to seek out the cases to support them to hospital. Don Bosco needed helpers, and with some courage he called on the older of his boys to come to his aid. In the end he had 40 devoted assistants who lent a hand in the hospitals or in the people's homes, finding out the abandoned cases and arranging for their removal to hospital, or else nursing them in their own homes. Some attempt was made to relieve the poverty of the very poor patients by providing bedclothes and other necessities. The meagre resources of the oratory were strained to the utmost. To have adopted such a course shows something of Don Bosco's courage. If the disease had broken out at the oratory, it may well have proved the end of the undertaking, for people would not have been slow to point out that Don Bosco was unfitted to have charge of the young if he exposed them to such danger. The risk was considerable, but he trusted in God's protection and Our Lady's prayers. Thus, on the 8th of December 1854, when the whole Catholic world was en fête to celebrate the definition that day of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, Don Bosco and his boys had in addition a private cause for celebration. They went in a body to the Consolata to thank God and his mother for the fact that all at the oratory had come through difficult months unscathed. Such undertakings as the oratory, his literary work, his labours during the cholera epidemic, and the retreats for working boys naturally made Don Bosco's name known far and wide throughout Piedmont. As a consequence, he was much in demand in the diocese and beyond as a special preacher. Missions, retreats, the 40 hours, triduums, panegyrics were rarely refused when requested by his colleagues in the clergy, and there must have been few pulpits within a radius of 40 miles, and perhaps even further afield, at that time or another, did not receive a visit from him. It was hard work, for in addition to the actual preaching, it involved travelling under the difficult conditions of those days. When the place lay on one of the main railway lines, there was perhaps little to complain of, but more often than not, it was to some remote mountain village, to some place like Chieri in his own country, that he was summoned. And then the journey by stagecoach was far different. The preacher arrived worn out by the extreme heat or almost frozen by the cold. Yet, increasingly, from the time of his leaving the convento down to 1860, Don Bosco devoted all his spare time to this form of work, though it remains a mystery still how he could ever find any time that was free either to prepare the sermons or to deliver them. His preaching was characteristic of the man. In his clear tenor voice, calmly and with great restraint of gesture and moderation of tone, he brought the message of the gospel. There were no fireworks about his preaching, but it was popular in the best sense of the word, because it was adapted to his audience. He gained its friendship at once, and illustrated what he had to say with a wealth of anecdote and example that made him easy to follow. Above all, he spoke with conviction. That his preaching was successful, if it is possible to gauge success of this kind, is proved by the number of those who were induced by it to lead better lives, to return to the sacraments, or to more fervent practice of their religion. Don Bosco was now in full maturity. We can observe in him the development of those gifts which were to be discerned in his youth. Throughout his life, the extent of his achievements is cause for wonder. It begins with his early struggles, when he was not content to confine himself to all the important matters of his education, but at the same time spent himself in his first efforts on behalf of his young companions. That he succeeded admirably in both undertakings was due to a happy combination of gifts, which served him until the end of his days. He possessed an extraordinary memory, which, with no effort, seemed to retain whatever he stored in it, and reproduce it at will without notice. Above all, he was endowed with a creative imagination, which, joined to a capacity for organization that is by no means common, enabled him to conceive and bring to fruition vast schemes, which to others, less singularly gifted, almost appeared as madness. Humans well describes him as a matchless organizer of God's business. His confidence in God's help was certainly unbounded, and by reason of it, in spite of difficulties and uncertainties about the outcome of many ventures, he remained calm and unruffled. He laughed at obstacles. The money for some projects, already undertaken of course, was not there today. No cause for alarm. It would certainly be there tomorrow. The chief thing, he used to say, is to take the burden on one's shoulders. As you press forward, it soon shakes down, and the load is evenly distributed. He was calm and unruffled in the face of adversity. He left all to God. He had abandoned himself entirely to the love of God, and could wait on his will with no shade of anxiety about the outcome. His one touchstone about any undertaking was always its utility. Was it useful for God's service? If it was, he was sure it would succeed. Of his great hold over the young, which sprang primarily from his affection for them, more still will be said in a later chapter, though it should be fairly clear by now that his love of his neighbour was, after his love of God, the mainspring of his life. Indeed, the two cannot be separated, for the one was the outcome of the other. Yet at first sight it seemed to be no way out of the ordinary. Typical Piedmontese country priest was the description applied to him by some who had not the benefit of close acquaintance with him. This stocky figure in an old but always clean cassock, wearing the serviceable boots and the large round hat affected by all the clergy in those days, his pockets crammed with sweets for any children that he might encounter on his ways, A few galleys of printers' proofs, to be corrected when he had a moment, protruding from them, stood out nevertheless from his colleagues. In spite of his thick and stumpy figures betraying his peasant origin, the poverty of his attire, the nobility of the expression on that square face with its finely chiselled nose and imposing forehead, showed an uncommon aristocracy, the only sort that really matters, for it was the aristocracy of holiness. At that time it was only dimly discerned by the very few, but increasingly as the years went on, it came to be realized by many, and long before his death.